All right. So as you're all probably aware, to begin with, the priority theme for this year at CSW is the effect of innovation and technical change on gender equality and education in the digital age. It's a massive theme. And we are going to be doing some work, particularly for people who are interested in the agreed conclusions and the negotiations around those, as we go through the process in New York. In particular, the first thing to know about is that I will hold a session on Tuesday morning, time and location yet to be advised, for people who are interested in really getting involved in the language piece. We'll go through the basics of how you do language negotiations and work out how we want to work together. The other key thing to know about is that there will be briefings that I'll organise every evening, certainly for the first week and at times during the second week, from 5 p.m. in the East Lounge in the UN building. So if you have an SCAP pass, you have a grounds pass for the UN, you will be able to get into the East Lounge and join us there each evening at 5 p.m. to work out what on earth you're getting up to, work out what everyone else is getting up to, and share information. The Australian government delegation will also be participating in those 5 p.m. briefings. So that's a really useful way of exchanging information. But the first thing to know about CSW, particularly if this is your first time going there in person, is that it's a really intense experience. So be prepared for something that will at times feel overwhelming, at times will require you to take yourself out of the environment in order to be able to rest and recuperate and to find your feet again. But also be prepared to be stimulated and invigorated in ways that you might not see coming, and to be worked really hard, essentially. It is intense, it is exciting, it is frustrating at times, and it can be dispiriting. And so one of the first tips that I would offer for participation in CSW is watch your mental state. And make sure that you're putting in place the things you need to have the best emotional and mental response, the experience that you can have. We are looking at a record number of people who have signed up for CSW this year. Normally we're looking at about 5,000 to 6,000 delegates attending CSW across both government delegations and NGOs. They're looking at something closer to 8,000 this time around. And so it's going to be a very action-packed and very crowded experience, but also one that's spread across the city a little bit. So we'll talk about that. For those who are coming to this very cold, the Commission on the Status of Women is one of the functional commissions of the Economic and Social Council of the UN. And what that means is that it sits in the same space that a lot of the practical human rights work is done at the UN, and it is the only multilateral forum dedicated to gender at the UN. We've seen gender move into other spaces, into the COP process and into G20 and APEC and other international spaces. But this is the only space in the UN process that's actually specifically dedicated to gender. And that makes it a really critical opportunity each year for us to be setting standards for how the UN thinks about a particular theme over the course of the next 12 months. Technically speaking, what CSW does is it monitors the progress that we're making on the Beijing Platform for Action. And earlier when we did our introductions, you will have heard Juliana say that she was there when that document was negotiated back in 1995. We didn't know it at the time, but the Beijing Platform for Action, or BPFA, as you might hear it called, turned out to be a bit of a high watermark in terms of what we're able to achieve, particularly in flashpoint areas around gender equality, relating to things like sexual and reproductive health and rights, and bringing down gender norms, dealing with stereotyping and that sort of thing. It was an amazing moment in time when we got this document by consensus at the Fifth World Conference for Women. The job of CSW is to try to hold states up to the mark on that document. One of the challenges we have is that that document is now from 1995, it's a long time ago, and it doesn't cover a number of critical areas which have emerged since then, such as climate change and the digital world. It also addresses issues like violence against women in ways that we probably wouldn't recognise so much now. And so it's a document that we are having to adjust and work with as we go. We had a process back in 2021 where Generation Equality was an attempt to hold an online version of a Council on Women. It has produced a number of documents and processes which are running almost simultaneously with the Beijing Platform for Action process, more as a modification of that process than as a replacement for it. And it's not clear at this stage what CSW's role is in relation to the generation equality work. But you will hear people at CSW talking about generation equality, and you can find information about that online. Here in Australia, one of the leads on generation equality was the International Women's Development Agency, and they've got lots of materials that you can find online if you're interested in pursuing that. The main output of CSW is the agreed conclusions. And that document is a consensus document, which means that we need to get everybody agreeing to it. Technically speaking, the Commission itself consists of 24 states, but any state that wishes to participate in the negotiations can do so. And routinely we get a good sample of a lot more, something closer to 50 states participating in CSW. That means we've got to get 50 states agreeing to the same language about what should be done to implement the Beijing Platform for Action in the context of the priority theme. That's not an easy process, particularly when you've got states like Iran and the Vatican in the room. And I don't mean to single those two out. They're by no means the only states that have complicated relationships with gender equality, but they are two of the ones that you'll hear about most prominently at this particular CSW. Iran because of what's happening domestically, and the Vatican because there is, I think, some internal discussions going on around gender, and we're seeing that manifest in international spaces in a tension and a tendency to want to defend conservative positions both within and without the Catholic Church. So it's an interesting environment that we're negotiating in this year, and we still need to get to a consensus document at the end of it. For people who are doing CSW from Australia, this is the first year that we've been able to get a strong hybrid presence at CSW, and it represents a pretty major step forward for participation. At this point, sadly, we are looking at a hybrid participation sitting very heavily in the NGO space and not so much in the official program, which is frustrating. One of the features of CSW over the past, 10, 15 years has been a gradual narrowing of the space available for NGOs to be involved in the official proceedings of CSW. Before I started doing CSW about 10 years ago, there was a golden period that Juliana might remember, when people were able to actually go into the room while the agreed conclusions were being negotiated, and actually watch the negotiations underway. It's an incredibly powerful thing. For the states to have to sit in front of all of those women and negotiate positions that might be disadvantageous to those women, it's actually a difficult thing to do. And sometime about 10 years ago, a little bit longer, a decision was made to exclude NGOs from the room while the negotiations took place. That exclusion feels a little bit like it's being replicated in the attempts to create a hybrid version of CSW. It feels like the real energy in creating a hybrid version is sitting in the NGO space, specifically with the organisation called NGO CSW. And that organisation organises a forum that runs parallel to the official events at CSW every year. You can register for that forum at the NGO CSW website, which you'll see up there on the slide. And I highly recommend you do that even if you're going to be there in person and participating in the official events, because this is your way in parallel events. So registering through NGO CSW then gets you access to an online portal, which you can access either through a web browser or through an app that you can download onto your phone or tablet. That online portal then gives you access to all the events that have been organised by NGO CSW, so that's their official program, and all of the parallel events that NGOs are holding. It doesn't give you access to the side events or to the official program, and I'll get onto that later on. The other thing I'll note about joining from Australia is that we still have an issue around time zone equity. I'm starting to hear the phrase time zone justice being used. There is this very interesting problem emerging where the time zones in which most things are held are simply not workable for people in our particular time zone band. That extends to most of the Pacific nations, some of Asia, and Australia. So you may find that quite a lot of what you want to see is happening at 12 a.m. or 3 a.m. in the morning. And at this point, plans to record and make available copies don't seem to be particularly well organised. It looks like in order to be able to see recordings after the event, you have to have an organiser who's prepared to arrange and host that themselves. It's not currently happening through the NGO CSW website. However, the thing about the hybrid arrangement is that they have opened up the online portal to people who want to run events from outside New York. And that's very new, and that allows people, say from Australia, from the Pacific, to be running events at times that actually work for us. So you will see that the program is 24 hours, runs all the way through. To get some view of what's happening in the official program, you can use UN TV. So UN Web TV is a website on the UN site. The link is there. And you can find the proposed organisation of work for CSW on the UN website. There are a number of official events that end up on UN TV, in particular the opening of CSW and the ministerial statements that are made by various ministers coming from different states. Events like that tend to get televised on this platform, and so you can also see those. And the useful thing about this is that quite a few of those events are then recorded and made available subsequently so that you can watch them at a reasonable time if you're in Australia. If you're in the UN for CSW, you probably won't be bothering with UN TV while you're in New York. So for those of you going to New York, first thing to do is to look for the building that's really hard to photograph because it's really big. You will be participating in New Not everybody who goes to CSW not everybody who goes to New York for CSW gets a UN grounds pass. Some people just go to participate in the parallel events, which are generally not held in the UN. The events that are mostly held in the UN are the official program, the negotiations, and the side events. And the side events are events that are held by states or by UN entities, often in combination. So you might get UN Women and the Australian government running an event together. And those events are generally held within the UN building, although we understand that it's been incredibly hard to get rooms in the UN building this time. And so we are finding that side events are also starting to appear at venues around the city as well. The UN building itself is in Manhattan. You will probably spend most of your time in Manhattan unless you have accommodation somewhere else. And most of the venues for other events are nearby. The first thing you need to do, and this is my big tip for your day one at CSW, is get your grounds pass. So if you have been accredited through an ECOSOC accredited organisation, you will be entitled to a pass, and you will have received an email from Indicio, which is the organisation that handles the registrations. You need to take that email and your passport to the UN grounds, the UN pass office, which is just around the corner from the UN building itself. You can see on the map there. The thing to know, the reason the photograph in the bottom right-hand corner is there is because the queues are enormous and you can spend hours waiting to get your pass. So if you are arriving before Monday, the 6th of March, you definitely should be getting your pass in advance. The pass office will be opening on Saturday and Sunday prior to CSW. They'll be open from 9 to 4. Actually, they'll be open 9 to 4 on the Friday before. And then on Saturday and Sunday, 10 to 6. And then in the first week, so Monday and Tuesday, they'll be open from 8 a.m. through until 6 p.m. And then Wednesday to Friday for the rest of the week from 9 to 4 p.m. Monday and Tuesday is generally the busiest days by far. So if you can avoid those, do. Try and get your pass on the weekend if you get in early enough for that. They will take your photo if you haven't had an EcoSoc pass taken before. If you have, you may find yourself suddenly with a pass that's got a really ancient photograph on it. Mine is literally 10 years old, which I love. But remember to bring a hairbrush if you've just stepped off the plane, because they will be photographing you. Once you've got your grounds pass, the next most obvious place to go is to the UN building to start orienting yourself. The best way to find the UN building is head for the East River, find the big tall building, and then head to the left, and you'll find the security entrance there. The security can take a long time. Monday and Tuesday morning in particular will be frantic, and it might take anything up to an hour to get through security. So give yourself time. And if you're going into the UN building, plan to stay. There are cafes and lounge areas in the UN building itself. It will take you a while to get in and out of the building if you wanted to nip backwards and forwards. So if you're planning to attend a combination of side events in the UN building and parallel events outside, make sure that you've programmed enough time to get yourself to the parallel event and then back into the UN building afterwards. The other trick about security to know is that after 6 p.m, you can't get back into the building. So if you've got an event that's running into the evening, you might need to make sure that you've got provision for your food and whatever you need, because the cafes will close generally at 5, and that you don't end up locked out of the building because you've nipped out to get something to eat. That's particularly important if you're doing the evening negotiations. When the negotiations start to run late into the night, you need to be prepared to essentially lock yourself into the building. The other locations you might be heading to is a range of different sort of community organisations, community venues where parallel events are scheduled. So the church centre, which is directly across from the UN, is a very common one. You'll see that they basically book out 2 or 3 floors of rooms for events there. The Armenian Convention Centre down the road is another that you'll see a lot. The Australian Mission to the UN is another good one to clock, because there is going to be an event on Monday night at the mission in the early evening. I think it begins at 5 p.m, but we'll check that in the next session. That's a meet and greet for Australians who have come for CSW. It's a really good opportunity to get to meet the Australian delegation, but it does mean that you need to RSVP for it, and places are limited. I'll be sending out an email about that this evening. So click on the link to make sure that you've RSVP'd for that if you're interested in going.
Sorry, Helen, can I just check, has that been changed from the Sunday?
Oh, I might be saying Monday because that's when it's been previously. Watch out for information from me this evening.
Yes, let's just double check that, because in our meetings, apologies. I've pressed
right. Yeah.
Apologies. Yes, in our catch up with Office Women last week, they were discussing Sunday night, but I'm not confirmed on that. So
I think you're right. We will have a representative from Office for Women talking about that in the next session. So we can do that one. Fantastic. Thanks, Jess. Well caught. Okay, so what happens over the 2 weeks? Week 1 is the busy one. It's when the government delegations all attend in their full strength. So we will hear more in the next session about who's on the government delegation this time around, but it sounds like it's a very large contingent attending in the first week. And then at the end of the first week, most of those people go home. leaving behind the people who are more focused on the language negotiations for the agreed conclusions. So in the first week, you might find yourself involved in strategy sessions if you're doing language work, so work around what the language should be in the next draft of the text, and then who we should be advocating to and how in relation to that language. Training sessions for different alliances, building your networks and meeting new groups of people. Various reception events tend to be held in the first week. International delegations from around the world will hold different events with different focuses. And then the NGO CSW forum is at its peak in the first week. So it has its consultation day, which is being held on the Sunday this time around. It holds the parallel events. The side events are also at their peak in the first week. The way to find out about the side events is via the UN Women website. So keep an eye out for details of, there will be an agenda and probably an app for the side events available through the UN Women website. And it's when the ministers make their country statements and participate in ministerial roundtables, and essentially when the government-to-government conversations occur. It's also when we kick off the negotiations for the agreed conclusions and the resolutions. There are usually 2 or 3 resolutions negotiated simultaneously while the agreed conclusions are underway. And the bulk of that starts in the middle of week 1 and moves on from there. Week 2, it gets a lot smaller. There are still side events and parallel events happening, but not quite as many. And lots of the CSO delegates, the civil society organisations will leave along with the more important people from the ministerial delegations. And the focus at that point turns to the negotiations. Because it is a time-limited process seeking to get a consensus document, essentially they negotiate until it's done. And that means that by Tuesday or Wednesday in the second week, if you're following the language, you can be sitting on the couches outside the room where the negotiations are happening until 4 a.m. in the morning at some times. I have once been at a CSW where we ran to 5 a.m. On the final day. So we actually ran into the Saturday and the gavel only came down on the final text at 5 a.m. Everybody was extremely relieved and very tired at that point. But it's, I think, an illustration of how important the space is, that it is so contested and that the negotiations are so difficult. It's an indication that the conversation is one that we really do need to be having, because it's very clear that we don't all have the same ideas about what gender equality means or the same ideas about how important gender equality is. A typical day at CSW, in the early morning, you might find yourself attending caucus meetings. So different groupings will get together. You might be part of an international organisation that might have its caucus meetings in the early morning. You might also be attending regional caucus meetings, although a number of those have been programmed through the NGO CSW program, and you can find them there. You check your emails for, if you're doing language negotiations, you might be checking for the latest drafts. You might be checking for information about the events that you want to be attending that day. Meeting up with friends to work on language or to network. Breakfast meetings are very common. And then during the day, you might be attending side events and parallel events. Doing your social media and your comms, if that's your thing. Networking and doing your advocacy is a big part of it. And then in the evening, you might be going to the 5 p.m. Australian government briefing. You might be going to functions and you might be preparing summaries for language positions that you use the next day. The photo that you have there is of the YWCA Australia delegation prepping fact sheets and language while having dinner in my hotel room about 5 years ago. Practicalities. If you've been to New York before, you'll have a bit of a sense of what to expect. It's an intense city. If you're not somebody who's from an urban area, New York can be very overwhelming. If you're someone who has accessibility needs, New York can be very challenging. If you're somebody who has mental health needs, New York can be very overwhelming. So keep those things in mind. It's also a fabulous place because it's actually quite easy to navigate your way around and find your way around. Both the traditional taxi cabs and Uber are operating in huge numbers. And so finding your way and finding some way to get somewhere is relatively simple. The subway is probably 10 minutes walk from the UN building. Grand Central Station is 12 minutes from the UN building. So you've got access to pretty good transport networks if you're staying outside of Manhattan. But one thing to know is that March in New York is generally known as the worst month to be in New York. It's cold, generally. It can still be very icy. And so you need to be very careful about your footwear. This is not a place for stilettos. If you really, really need your stilettos, then you need to carry them with you and have a bag that you can put your sensible footwear in when you get wherever you're going. Same with your coats, because all the buildings are really heated. So I tend to layer up here in Australia in winter. I live in Canberra where it does actually get a little bit cold. And so that's an approach I have to abandon when I go to New York. Layering works to a certain extent, but really what you need is a really big coat that you can then take off. But make it one that's not too heavy, because you're going to have to carry it around all day. One of the things that I've found is most practical is to get a really daggy but crushable puffer jacket that is capable of being crushed into a small bag, particularly the ones that go into a stuff sack that you can then put into your backpack and carry around when you're inside the building, wearing your smart casual or whatever underneath. Besides footwear and a good coat, you're probably going to need hats and gloves. And you might need more than one, because the number of hats and gloves that get lost while you're over there is quite extraordinary, no matter how hard you're trying. And do try to make sure you've got snacks or something similar that's going to help you to get through the day if you find that the weather gets so bad that there's no point in you leaving the building you're in. We've had a couple of CSWs where we've had snow days, where all official proceedings have been closed down and the UN has been closed because bad weather came in. We've had a few sessions where people haven't been able to land in New York because a blizzard has come through. I once came through at the front of a blizzard, which was very exciting, and landed just as it hit the city. So be aware that the weather can be very changeable. It can be snow, it can be rain. A small umbrella is not a bad idea, although most of the time, if you've got a mildly waterproof jacket with a hood, you can get around New York because there are lots of awnings. Make sure, as I say, that you're watching what you eat and be quite healthy about it, because the food that's available in the UN is pretty terrible. There's not a lot by way of salads. You're going to be looking at some sandwiches as one of your best options, but they're going to be pretty meat heavy. And if you are vegetarian or vegan, it's getting slowly better, but you might want to have options available for yourself just in case. If you are kosher, you're probably going to be pretty well catered for. Halal, not quite so much, but getting better. Certainly outside of the UN building, kosher and halal are well catered for, with specialist supermarkets dotted around the place, so you will be able to find stuff. Prep your diary carefully and watch the time zones. So some of the apps that will tell you what's on when will automatically adjust to your time zone. Some won't. So if you're in Australia, you may find that you're being shown New York times. You may find that you're being shown Australian times. Check that. If you're in New York, you may find that Outlook has real trouble with events that you've put into your calendar in advance, that it then converts to New York time and gets completely wrong. So watch out for that. But do put a schedule together for yourself and make sure that that schedule includes time for you to sit quietly and think, and time to get out and actually walk when there's a bit of sun. The UN has good Wi-Fi, but other areas in New York are patchy. Starbucks is your fallback. There is always good internet at Starbucks. But have a think about what documents you really, really need, and maybe pop them on your desktop of your laptop or on another device so that you've got them physically with you in case you can't get to the Wi-Fi. That's pretty much everything on the actual event, except to say that the events, particularly the parallel events, will fill up. So get there early. You see the image there about the full sign. They do close events. You'll end up with people sat on the floor, people crowding in around the doorway. And the problem is fire regulations don't let them do that. So they will shut events. And so if it's something that you really need to get to, make sure that you're there early. We've talked a little bit about the CSW NGO forum. Things to watch out for is we don't yet have details for the rally on International Women's Day. There is traditionally one. It generally starts in Dag Hammarskjöld Park, which is just next to the UN building, and moves through the city, usually up to Times Square. No details about that yet, but keep an eye out. The place you're most likely to see it is the CSW NGO Forum app. The Woman of Distinction Award forms part of the NGO Forum, the consultation day we've talked about, and the parallel event program. So make sure that you check out that website. And then just a little bit of quick information about things you might hear about that might be useful for you to have in your head. People might talk about the state blocks, or they might talk about Africa, or you might hear terms like WEOG. They're references to the state blocks. So CSW is organised, like much of the rest of the UN, into particular regional groupings. There's an African group, an Asia Pacific group, which we are not a member of. The Eastern European group, Latin American and Caribbean group, which gets called something else, which will come to me in a moment. There is the Western European and other group, which is worth you knowing about because that's WEOG, and that's us. So we are included as a sort of relic of colonialism in the Western European and others group. But those are very administrative blocks. They're the ones that are determine who gets to have a seat, for example, on the CSW bureau. Whereas Australia actually negotiates with a different grouping when they're in CSW. As I was saying earlier, there are 45 member states of the UN who form the commission, and that's a rotating thing. You get elected to that. Australia has just come off the commission. And the Bureau is the commission states who are responsible for running CSW. So this year is being chaired by South Africa, and the agreed conclusions are being facilitated by Argentina, which we think is a really good thing because Argentina is relatively progressive and appears to be pushing for a good process this year. So we're pleased to see that. Other key players, you'll hear references, we've already talked about NGO CSW, and we've talked about UN Women. UN Women is actually an entity of the UN, and it is responsible for working with ESCAP to set up the Commission on the Status of Women and run it. And so it provides support to all of the official program, and that's where you'll find the information about the official program. There are other coalitions. I'm part of a women's rights caucus. There's a SOGI caucus, which is sexual orientation and gender identity, and a range of other caucusing groups. There are a number of different permutations of Pacific and Pacific Island caucuses who will be meeting at CSW. There's also the Women's Major Group, which is actually a group that's come out of the climate change and environment sector and participates in the COP processes. But it's increasingly starting to talk into the CSW space as well. And then you've all decided to go to CSW, so I don't think you need convincing about this, but the things that we're broadly looking to do when we're there is influence. We are looking to leverage Australia's relatively progressive position on gender in useful ways to raise the barrier, the basic standard across the world. We're looking for accountability, both internationally by watching each other, but also domestically here in Australia by getting the Australian government to commit to positions internationally, and then bringing those positions home and holding the Australian government accountable to them. That's particularly interesting in the areas of health in Australia, particularly sexual and reproductive rights and health. And also in the area of Indigenous policy, where Australia has a tendency to be out there as a glorious, proponent of Indigenous rights and First Nations people's rights, and yet, in Australia, has some significant work to be done there. So the accountability piece is really important. It's great for networking, and you will learn things about your subject area that you just didn't know, or new ways of seeing your subject area. And that last bit, seeing it differently, I think is really critically important. And it's about learning and listening. It's about looking for opportunities where you can use your own privilege to bring forward the voices of others. And it's about looking for opportunities to learn and challenge your own preconceptions about the way gender equality does and should operate. We are going to do a training session on how to do the agreed conclusions in New York on the Tuesday, as I mentioned earlier. So I won't go into this in any depth, but if this is an area that's particularly of interest to you, make sure that you have filled out the form that is being circulated by email, which is the sign up for the WhatsApp group that I'll be running in New York, because that's where the details of that session will be. I'm going to wrap us up there because I want to give us 5 minutes to have a little bit of a break before we launch into the next part of the program today. But has anyone got any questions that they'd like to ask at this point? Use the raise hand function and you'll come to my attention using that. There's a lot of information to throw at you all at once. And if questions occur to you later, or if there's something specific you want to ask about that I haven't covered, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm at era@ywca.org.au. Very happy to take any queries. And if you're not getting emails from me about CSW, there is a link for you to join up for CSW. We'll be sharing that link in the last session of the pre-departure briefing, and it will also be in the emails that come out this evening. So if you're not getting emails from me, ask other people that you know who are attending CSW and ask them to forward you the link. I'm not seeing, oh, I've got some chat. The recording will be made available because that is an awful lot of information. And also there are people who have put extra tips into the chat. So make sure you've had a quick look at those before you leave this session. But we'll make this recording available to everybody who's going. And if, as I say, if you've got questions, do feel free to email me. There are also lots of other very experienced people who are going to CSW. So there are always feel free to ask the people who are around you. Nobody knows everything about CSW. You will find me asking questions, particularly Juliana gets this occasionally from me. So make sure that you are always asking questions when you're there. The amount of information that you will be able to take in all at once will always be a bit limited. So don't feel like you need to know it. Always feel that you can ask. All right, I will wrap us up there for the moment.